JRPGs are the best genre, let's face it. We all love a good story to go alongside some tactical combat. If you're the same age as me and you ate the genre for breakfast on the PS1 as a kid, this is going to be the list for you. This is pretty much every JRPG on the Nintendo Switch that has a physical release. That's the decider. They must have a physical release because this is physical paradise. So as much as I want to celebrate the last remnant, it's not on a cartridge, so it's not in my heart. But what does constitute a JRPG? What decides what makes it on this list or not? It is a tough one because RPG alone is so goddamn broad nowadays, it's lost all meaning. Pretty much every single game made in the modern era has RPG elements in some capacity, so instead of listing all 3,000 Nintendo Switch games, I've had to be a little bit strict. For me, the decider is, if the game was to be released in, say, 2002, would it be considered a JRPG? If the answer is yes, it's in. People from 2002 have much better judgment than we do, okay? And yes, for me, the game must be made in Japan or other Asian regions, which were also producing similar sort of story-led RPGs at the time. Games that are honest homages to JRPGs like Sea of Stars will not be in this video. It just opens up too many cans of worms that's way above my pay grade. So, shall we jump in? It's gonna be a long one. Let's start with the granddaddy pretty much, the Dragon Quest series. Since the last time I made this video, thankfully Square Enix decided to show a little bit more love for the series on the Switch. Let's break down what we've got. Dragon Quest 1, 2, and 3 are available via physical release in Asia. The physical does have English though, and while they are classic games and heavily nostalgic, especially for Americans, it's worth noting that these are based on earlier mobile remakes rather than the NES versions. That's definitely put some people off, but myself, having no nostalgia for them, found them to be decently enjoyable times, a great history lesson as well. And they must hold up too because there are 2 upcoming physical releases of remakes. Firstly, Dragon Quest III HD 2D Remake. This has been long awaited. I think it's been like 3 years or something since they announced this, much to the excitement of everyone because it fits like a glove. The beautiful art style in a great and pioneering game. This is releasing very soon, maybe around the time that I actually edit this together. Then next year, we are getting a release of Dragon Quest 1 and 2 HD 2D Remake in the same vein as 3. So why are we going to go backwards? Well, it kind of makes sense because 3 is actually the beginning of this timeline, and these 3 games are kind of connected together, so you'll actually be playing them in order. I don't think this one has 100% been confirmed for a physical release, but it would be incredibly bizarre if it didn't. So I think it's safe to say we will get one. But those 2 are future games, because the Switch has other Dragon Quest games on it already, the biggest and unarguably the best being Dragon Quest XI Echoes of an Elusive Age, which is one of the best JRPGs of its generation, one of the most AAA JRPGs Square has ever made. Okay, it's cartoonish, but the amount of effort is undeniable. The production value is through the roof, and this version on Switch also includes the 3DS Retro 2D graphics as well if you want that. It is a top tier Switch JRPG. Perhaps slightly less essential would be Dragon Quest Monsters The Dark Prince, a return to the monster catching style gameplay that I love so much on the Game Boy Color. It's definitely lost some of its charm and doesn't have quite the budget I think it needed, but it's a great alternative to Pokemon and has a unique season shifting mechanic to add a lot of variety to environments. Dragon Quest Treasures is one I feel came and went. It was popular for a couple of days, then everyone forgot about it. Well, when it originally released, I thought it would be a spiritual successor to Dragon Quest Monsters, since Square didn't do much with that sub-series for like a decade or so, but no, it's just another commendable spin-off. Infinity Strash, Dragon Quest The Adventure of Dai, is the most spin-offery of the franchise that's on the Switch, and it's the one that's divided opinion the most. In fact, there was a lot of hate directed towards this game. I think due to marketing. It's a very simple action RPG, linear with simple missions. For what it is, I think it's pretty fun, but maybe that's not what people expected with the trailers and things like that. The physical release for this was only released in Japan and Asia, but they do have English. Shall we stick with Square Enix? Because they are the kings of JRPGs, so we might as well go through their entire library. Let's start off with their most beloved franchise, the world-renowned Bravely Default 2. Okay, so this one came and went. There was a decent amount of hype around when it was released, and I think most people liked it, but most fans consider it to be not as good as Bravely Second, nor did it have the likable characters found in the original. I personally haven't played this one, but I want to because it's heavily inspired by old school Final Fantasy with crystals and job systems. It looks gorgeous and sounds great too. It's also usually very affordable these days. Chrono Cross, the Radical Dreamers edition, was a long-awaited re-release of a well-loved PS1 JRPG. This physical release only came out in Southeast Asia, but it does play in English. Some feel it wasn't a great port, but I think they fixed most things in a small patch. But yeah, this is a strange game with a lot of characters to recruit and take on your adventure. It's a classic. It comes bundled with a visual novel adventure game called Radical Dreamers, which is a nice bonus. And the physical release for this only released in Southeast Asia. There are quite a few Mana games on the Switch. Most of them have physical releases. You want to start with the collection of Mana, which includes the first 3 games in the series. The original Game Boy game called Final Fantasy Adventure, one of the best RPGs available on that system. It also includes the classic Secret of Mana, and for the first time in English, Trials of Mana, which contains some of the most gorgeous sprite work ever created. Also a great multiplayer experience, the latter of which has great replayability due to different starting characters, each with their own story. It's a bit like the SaGa series in that respect. And Trials of Mana was remade pretty much at the same time with its own physical release. And although it's lost its multiplayer aspect and had the budget that left something to be desired, it's a great game that, again, offers something very different. Also has some of the worst English voice acting I've heard in a long while, always good for a laugh. Legend of Mana Remastered is my favorite game in the Mana series. Shame then that the physical release was only available in Southeast Asia. But it does have English. This is such a lovely, mysterious game where everyone who plays it will have a slightly different experience due to the order of places you visit, the events you unlock, and where you place towns and locations. It can affect things in small or big ways, and it's wonderful. I often think about this game even though I have no nostalgia for it. I only played it when it released on the Switch, and it's one of my most recommended imports. Speaking of which, if you want to purchase physical video games, consider using the links down below in the description and pinned comment. You'll find links to Video Games Plus and Play Asia. Both are excellent websites that help support the channel immensely. Video Games Plus have free worldwide shipping for orders over 80 Canadian dollars, which is about 60 American bucks, and all their prices are in Canadian money, which means the exchange rate is often very favorable and cheap compared to buying in the US. Some games, however, are only available in Japan and Asia, as I've mentioned. Despite that, the ones mentioned in this video, I mention them because they do have English, and if you purchase them via Play Asia with the links in the description, you can also get a tasty 5% off with the code Jordan24, which is good to go until the end of this year. Alongside a generic affiliate link, I've also posted an Excel sheet to really swell the balls of an admin nerd. That has a list to every game in this video, alongside a link to help support me at the same time, and I genuinely 100% appreciate your support ever so much. Thank you. Okay, now let's move on to Square's big, real franchise, the SaGa series. Yes, it's SaGa, not Salsa, although that perhaps would make for a more unique video game experience. Saying that, if you want an RPG that does things very differently, these are the places to go. And once again, there's a ton of physical releases for the Switch, so let's get on with it. Let's start with Romancing Saga Minstrel Song, which is a remake of the first game in the series. Currently, the physical release is only available in Southeast Asia and Hong Kong, but early next year, it's getting a Western physical release called the International Version via Red Art Games. This is a full 3D game with a large world that you're free to explore and do various missions. It should be called Side Quest the Game, because that's essentially what you're doing, but there are lots of main characters to choose from who start in different places on the map and can get different party members at different times. I'll say for most of this segment, the series is more about the gameplay than the main story. They're very idiosyncratic. Romancing Saga 2 is just a HD port of the Super Famicom game. This is the first time it's been in English, and the physical release is only available in Hong Kong with some incredible artwork. Romancing Saga 3 also had a similar release, first time in English and only available physically in Asian regions, but that one has two different versions. The Southeast Asian release is the one with the funky box art. That's the better version, although it is a bit more expensive. There is also a Hong Kong release which is cheaper, has nicer artwork, but the visuals in the game have been compressed because they cheaped out and wanted to make it fit on a smaller cartridge. It is small but noticeable, so make your choice. I am getting ahead of myself though, since we need to go back to Romancing Saga 2, because very soon, in fact, yes, as I'm recording this, Romancing Saga 2 Revenge of the Seven has just released physically worldwide, and this is a full-blown 3D remake. It looks ace, and you can see that Square put a little bit of budget into this. The series is niche in the West, but from what I'm aware, back in Japan, Romancing Saga 2 is considered like an all-time classic, and is revered almost as much as like Final Fantasy VI. So we are being blessed with this remake that was purely aimed at Japan, but hey, it is getting a worldwide physical release. Awesome. We're not done with Saga yet, far from it, oh no. Saga Frontier Remastered is my personal favorite game in the franchise, purely down to the fact it's a bit more traditional. Sure, it's still idiosyncratic, but less so, and it's easier for the casual JRPG fan to get into it. Like, if you want something that's closer to Final Fantasy, this is as close as you're going to get with the series. Even though, once again, it has lots of starting characters, each of which start in a different location, and they have their own mini story, it's a game that just oozes classic PS1 JRPG. I like it a lot. The physical release for this was only in Southeast Asia and Hong Kong, but does have English, and I would say out of all the Saga games, this is the essential one, in my opinion. Of course, I haven't played Romancing Saga 2 Remake, but I'd still choose this one first. But there's also some more recent games in the series, like Saga Scarlet Grace Ambitions, which was originally a Vita game. On the Switch, it first released physically in Japan, but did not have English. However, many years later, there was a release in Hong Kong that did have English. This, for me, was the game in the franchise that showed to me Square Enix had lowered the series' relevance just a little bit. I've heard it's a good game, but you can clearly see they were given the budget to, buy everyone on the dev team a bottle of 7-Up and a packet of Rolos, and that's it. Saga Emerald Beyond is the latest game in the series, like the latest brand new one, and once again, I haven't played it, not because I'm a budget snob, far from it, but it looks like it cut corners in every aspect. Static, non-immersive cutscenes, small environments, few characters. They seem to have focused entirely on the battle system, which for me personally is one of the least important aspects of a JRPG. Maybe I shouldn't judge it because I haven't played it, but the physical release for this was originally in Japan. That does not have English, but a little bit later on there was an English version released in Southeast Asia. We are sticking with Square Enix, we're far from done with these guys. Let's take a look at Tokyo RPG Factory. They were a development team focused on budget JRPGs during a time when Square would only pump out big budget games, so they were almost a breath of fresh air, especially with I Am Setsuna, which was a launch title in Japan physically, but it does have English. It's heavily inspired by Chrono Trigger in the battle system. It has an interesting enough story, setting, and great music. It doesn't quite come together as a classic, but it was a good effort at reaching out for the good old days. I do recommend giving it a try. Afterwards, they developed Lost Sphere, which at the time was considered to be like a 5 out of 10 kind of game from the critics, but I think retrospectively, JRPG fans who have had the time to soak in all of the game, it is a long game, actually have started to appreciate it a lot more, perhaps saying it's Tokyo RPG Factory's best title. I personally have not played it, but I recently did order it and it just arrived in the mail a couple of days ago, and maybe once I retire from YouTube, maybe I'll be able to give it a go. Oninaki was their final game before they were merged back into Square Enix's core team, essentially dissolving them. And this was more of an action RPG where you equip monsters to change your fighting style. It has a dark, morose story that could have done with a bit more budget to help the presentation, in that department. But, maybe it's considered the weakest of the trilogy, but perhaps more fondly thought of after the fact. I have only played the demo for this and it didn't sell me on it, but if I can get it cheap, perhaps I'll give it a shot. This did not physically release in North America, so if you want it physically, you'll have to get it from Japan, Asia, or Europe. Live Alive is a gorgeous looking remake of a Super Famicom game that originally never released in the West. This is a wonderful multi-story game that, to be honest, would not look out of place if it was in the SaGa series, but this one has you going through different time periods where all the stories eventually connect together into one. There's a strategy aspect to the battles, and the presentation is top-notch, a nice surprise release from Square. The Diofield Chronicle was a one-off release that seemed like it came from nowhere. Wasn't marketed particularly well, didn't sell particularly well, and now Square Enix seem to be discouraged about making B or C tier budget releases once again. It's cyclic, and they don't understand why. Or they do, but as long as their investors are happy, they just do what they want. This is a real-time strategy game that has a good political story that fans of the original Final Fantasy Tactics may enjoy. It looks good, although overall the gameplay is a bit basic and lacking in depth. You can get it cheap nowadays, and maybe give it a shot if you can find it for 20 bucks. Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon is one of my favorite import exclusives. It's an accessible entry point into the Mystery Dungeon subgenre, being less demanding than most and having an identifiable structure and progress. It also doesn't crush your soul if you perish. This adds a lot to the game that originally came out on the DS and then the Wii and now Switch. Sadly, the physical release is only available in Japan, but it does have English. Harvestella is Square Enix trying to get in on some of that farming action RPG action. It's Final Fantasy meets Rune Factory, and it's exclusive to the Switch at the time of writing this. It's a pretty commendable game, even if there's some lessons to be learned if a sequel ever pops up. But it's nice to see Square branching out and trying to create a new franchise rather than just labeling it, Final Fantasy Farming or whatever. It deserves a purchase for that restraint alone. Well done, Square. The World Ends With You is a well-loved series from Square. Perhaps series is a bit generous since there are only 2 games, but both are on the Switch, and this is more for the hip, cool kids, of which I am not one of them. The original game was on the DS but came to the Switch as The World Ends With You Final Remix. Due to the original control scheme, it definitely wasn't a smooth transition to a more standard console, but it could work. Maybe best to still play the original DS version though. But there was a brand new sequel called Neo The World Ends With You, which with the same name, the marketing, the box art, pretty much no one who's actually invested in gaming, and especially the series, would realize they were different. No wonder the sequel failed, and another reason Square backtracked on producing mid-budget games. It's your fault, Square. Work on your marketing better. Octopath Traveler 1 and Octopath Traveler 2 are some of the most essential JRPGs on the system, especially the second, which seemed to fix most of the problems the original game had. Not entirely, but enough to make it even more loved. Now don't get me wrong, the first game was almost considered revolutionary for its art style, and it paved the way for so many games using that same engine. But after the hype died down and people looked at it closer, and they could see the cracks that stopped it being perfect. But I still think you should experience both, but if you can only choose one, choose the second one. I don't believe they're connected via story. One of the games that took the art style and engine and produced by the same people is Triangle Strategy. Another dumb name, another great game. This is the game that people were itching for when they were clamoring for another Final Fantasy Tactics game, one in the same vein as the more serious PS1 original. It didn't get universal acclaim because I think some reviewers didn't take enough meds to get through the story-heavy segments in the beginning, but I love a good political intrigue story alongside my gameplay. Because, gameplay is easy to come up with, an interesting story isn't. And that's where so many games fall by the wayside for me, so they tried and they did a good job here. Just give it a few hours and let it set the foundations, and I'm sure you'll have a great time. Various Daylife is a game that was originally an Apple arcade game, made specifically for phones on Apple's subscription service, but after a short time, it made the transition to the Nintendo Switch, and for a phone game, you have to admit, the budget is pretty good, standing side by side with other JRPGs on the system. Okay, maybe it's not up to that standard, but still a commendable effort nonetheless. And, there is some negativity about it. I mean, just look at the reviews on Steam. But that's because this has elements of character stat raising rather than your standard JRPG. If you played Princess Maker or something like that, it's kind of similar, which works on mobile, maybe less so on proper consoles, I don't know. But the Nintendo Switch physical release was only in Southeast Asia. It does have English though. Star Ocean, the second Story R, is a remake of the second Star Ocean game, and all things considered, it's supposed to be excellent. Another one with a 2D HD art style. Personally, I think I do slightly prefer the PSP remake visuals, but I'm a weird guy who likes the chunky, pre-rendered look to those sprites, I don't know. Aside from that, this is a top-tier remake of a galaxy-spanning JRPG. The box art says download required, but that was a mistake. It's not mandatory, and as far as I'm aware, it only adds some additional English voiceovers, so yeah, not essential. Speaking of remakes or remasters, Tactics Ogre Reborn is another one, another classic. This one has been ported and remade more times than my daughter's Play-Doh set, each time with a slightly different piece of fluff or hair in it. Oh wait, that's a Play-Doh, not this game. This game often gets something new or tweaked in transition. This is based on the PSP version, but has significant changes to the way the class system works. Some loved the change, some felt it was unnecessary meddling with the Stone Cold classic. Kinda like if they remade Final Fantasy VII, but this time with real-time combat. As though that would ever happen. But either way, still a great game, worth a purchase if you want to find out what Final Fantasy Tactics was before Final Fantasy Tactics. Dungeon Encounters may very well be Square Enix's most indie game ever. Made by a core team of RPG veterans, this was designed to be a pure distilled experience, getting rid of all the genre fluff and concentrating on a lo-fi dungeon crawling experience. To some, it works. To others, it feels a bit too barren, probably why the physical release is only available in Southeast Asia. I believe that's all of Square Enix's releases, right? They've had nothing else. Oh, hang on, my list says something about Final Fantasy? I don't know what that's all about, but they've got a lot of them. Final Fantasy 1-6 Pixel Remaster is exactly that, an essential package that contains the first 6 Final Fantasy games in their best form yet. You get Final Fantasy 1, the one that started it all, Final Fantasy 2, the black sheep of the family, Final Fantasy 3, which started the whole job system thingy. These 3 are really nice, required reading almost if you call yourself a fan of the genre and series, but things really get tasty when we get to Final Fantasy 4, which is where they started to take the narrative far more seriously, playing with our emotions, having twists and turns. Then Final Fantasy V, one of my favorites. It took the job system to the next level and gave us a bunch of really well-loved characters. And Final Fantasy VI. I mean, some say it's the best JRPG of all time, a masterpiece that has yet to be surpassed. You get all these games on one cartridge. After a much ballsed up Western release, now finally there is a more widely available physical release of this game in both Europe and North America. It is not cheap, but it is worth every single penny in my opinion. In Asia and Europe, there was also a very tasty double pack for Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII, which again, for me, is just as essential. Okay, it's only 2 games, but if you live in North America, you should be importing this because you get my favorite game of all time, and also my favorite mini game of all time. It's often found fairly cheap, and this is when, JRPGs blew into the mainstream, which I think some people are still bitter about, wanting to keep their Chrono Trigger all to themselves. But hey, I really love both of these games, so much nostalgia, and I think even modern gamers will probably enjoy them too if they can get past the blocky visuals. Moving on up in the series, Final Fantasy IX is considered by some to be the pinnacle of the series. I personally do not agree with that, but I see where you're coming from. You're coming from Hipster Town. No, Town is too mainstream. How about Hipster Hamlet? Joking aside, this is a phenomenal game, but sadly the Switch port did not get a physical release in the West. However, Southeast Asia came to the rescue with a quickie release with sideways box art, a great one to import for your collection. It has English and is one of the most popular games to import. There is a double pack of Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy II HD remasters on the Switch. However, the Western physical is slightly rubbish since it only has Final Fantasy X on the cartridge. The second game is a download. But if you get the physical from Asia or Japan, both games are on the cartridge, plays in English. Say what you want about the laugh that people lack context in, Final Fantasy X is a phenomenal JRPG, one of the best stories ever told in video games. X-2 is a bit of a Marmite jobbo, but it's still preferred to have it on the actual cartridge so you can own it forever. Now, there is no Final Fantasy XI on the Switch because that's for an alternative universe, but we do jump to Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age, which has a very satisfying standard release worldwide, no caveats, just your basic bastard cartridge. And this is a unique game. They were trying to evolve the franchise, and I think they're still trying to do that since this came out, successful or not. That's for you and your own opinion, but hey, still a great time, even if it doesn't feel like a Final Fantasy, but you know, there's a bunny girl in it, so that helps. World of Final Fantasy Maxima is a spin-off of the franchise, and a really nice one at that, especially at the time it released because it felt like, you know, a standard Final Fantasy game that we've been craving for since, you know, Square were gunning for the next blockbuster reinvention of the franchise. The only sticking point of this one may be the art style for some. The physical release was only in Southeast Asia, but it does have English. Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion is a HD port of a game that was once a PSP exclusive. Perhaps not the most traditional JRPGs, in fact some may say it's not a JRPG, but it's getting stuck in here anyways. It's a prequel to Final Fantasy VII, starring Zack Fair, who some of the more hipster FF7 fans seems to like more than Cloud, I don't know why, but this is a good game. I'm not a big fan of the story personally, but that's just my stubbornness, okay? Fantasian Neo Dimension is not developed by Square Enix, but it is published by them on the Nintendo Switch, and the fact that it's a game made by Hironobu Sakaguchi, the father of Final Fantasy, and the soundtrack is from the legendary Nobuo Uematsu, it is a recipe for success. This was originally a mobile game that was released on Apple Arcade, but once that contract expired, it was always going to come to its natural home on a console. I patiently waited it out, and I'm glad I did because it's releasing physically in December. Not long to go. Front Mission First Remake and Front Mission 2 Remake are grey area releases because technically these games were made by some Polish dudes, something like that, but they are remakes based on games made in Japan by Square. They are Square games, so they count. These were two Super Famicom releases of mech strategy RPGs, slow, methodical, perhaps more for nerds of mech customization than for the story and gameplay, but I've heard they're pretty good. The first remake was available physically worldwide, but the second game did get a limited print in Europe via Forever Limited. They took pre-orders, at least. I don't know if they actually produced the game as of yet, but if you're just looking for an assured, accessible way to get the second game on a cartridge, you can get it from Japan, and it does have English. Alright, we're finally done with Square. Who shall we move on to next? How about one of the most prolific companies in video game publishing, Bandai Namco? They have so many games on the Switch, and loads of RPGs. Let's start with the .hack GU last recode, a quad pack that contains 4 connected JRPGs in one. You get Rebirth, you get Reminisce, Redemption, and a brand new volume created just for this modern console port, Reconnection. Okay, it's more of an epilogue about less than half the length of one of the other 3 games, but it's still a nice touch that they didn't need to do. These are meta stories that involve a game within a game. It's very 2000s-ish with a, you know, futuristic video game cyber thing going on. I don't really get it. But apparently they do tell an interesting story. The gameplay may be a bit simple for some, and the world a bit, you know, overly complicated, but it's still a good time. This was released physically in North America via Bandai Namco's website, but now the best way to get it is the Japanese version, which plays in English just fine. Baten Kaitos 102 HD Remaster is a fine double pack of 2 games that were previously exclusive to the GameCube, so it's been a while. They were quite obscure, but worth seeking out for a console that didn't have too many JRPGs in comparison to the beastly PS2. These have card gameplay with, you know, the battle thing, so I've always been very reluctant to try them myself because I'm not sure how immersed I could be, but people less stubborn than myself really enjoy them. This double pack did not release physically in North America, but you can get a European copy or an Asian one just fine, it plays in English. There are 3 Digimon physicals on the Switch with 4 games in total. Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth Complete Edition is one that's a double pack, and this contains Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth and its sequel Cyber Sleuth Hacker's Memory. 2 games which a lot of fans consider to be better than Pokemon. Turn-based battles with over 300 Digimon sounds good to me. Simple, easy enough with a good story and production values, a really nice double pack for monster collecting fans. Digimon Survive is always the harder sell though, because amongst being a strategy RPG, most of the time you're playing a visual novel adventure sort of game. The JRPG-ness very much takes a back seat here, much to many people's displeasure since they bought something they didn't realize they were getting. But if you like visual novels, then the JRPG is a bit of a bonus really. Digimon World Next Order was originally a PlayStation Vita game but randomly found itself on the Nintendo Switch many years later. It wasn't as loved as the original Digimon World games, but I think some people have grown to appreciate it during its re-release. Good monster collecting, slightly janky, but then again, which one isn't? This did release physically worldwide, but the North American release is quite rare and expensive to get these days. One Piece Odyssey is a turn-based RPG, one of the many One Piece games on the system. I believe this is the only one that can be called an RPG though. I'm not wholly familiar with the franchise as a non-anime guy, but this, I am told, is just another mediocre game within the franchise. The plot was written by the original creator, although even that is supposed to be rather forgettable. Two borderline essential JRPGs on the system would be two Ni no Kuni games. The first game, Wrath of the White Witch, is an adorable game, full of heart and lovely mechanics that almost makes it a masterpiece. Not quite, it's almost there. The Studio Ghibli partnership really paid off for this one, and I highly recommend it. It has monster catching, a heartwarming story, a heart-wrenching story I should say, beautiful visuals, amazing music, I love it. Ni no Kuni 2 Revenant Kingdom had less involvement with Studio Ghibli, and it obviously shows. While it expanded the gameplay into different mechanics like war battles, base building, the production did have a bit of a dip in my opinion. It also lost some of its heart, but compared to its peers, it's still a really nice package with a lot of content. The Nintendo Switch is blessed with a lot of strategy RPGs connected with mecha worlds of Gundam and other anime. First with SD Gundam G-Generation Genesis, which was originally a Vita game. The physical release for this was originally in Japan. That did not have English, but later came a Southeast Asian release that does have English. But you also may want to take a look at SD Gundam G-Generation Cross-Rays Platinum Edition, which is the base game and all of the DLC included. Both of these games kind of similar, strategy RPGs that mixes 3D model animation with 2D character sprites. There's an absolute ton of content as you play through famous anime scenarios and arcs with some really badass presentation. I'd say that these are essential. The Super Robot Wars series is pretty much the same gameplay, but I think it's presented even better. It's all sprites, no slightly dodgy 3D, and the attack animations are insane. You feel like you're properly in an anime that just so happens to be 50 hours long. These have one long new narrative, unlike the splintered anime narratives of the G-Generation games. You have to be careful which one of these you buy though. If you check the document linked below in the description, it will guide you to which one you can buy and not to the one that you shouldn't buy, because not all versions of these have English. Currently on the Switch, there's Super Robot Wars 30, Super Robot Wars T, Super Robot Wars V, and Super Robot Wars X. There are currently 3 Sword Art Online games on the Switch, with a 4th coming very soon. In fact, it might be out right now, I don't know, I'm recording this in November. Sword Art Online Fractured Daydream is arriving in early October, which, yeah, okay, it means it's out by the time I publish this video. Interestingly, this will be the first game in the series to have a physical release in North America. The others on the Switch only got as far as Europe. I don't know much about this series, it's always scared me what with the online thing going on. I just want to play alone, goddammit. But you can also get Sword Art Online, Alicization Licorice, don't know, Sword Art Online Fatal Bullet, and Sword Art Online Hollow Realization. As I said, these games only released physically in Europe, not in North America. Taiko no Tatsujin Rhythmic Adventure Pack is a double pack of rhythm JRPGs. A very quirky genre mashup, but it works. This double pack, which only released in English in Southeast Asia, this features the catchily named Rhythmic Adventure 1 and Rhythmic Adventure 2. They had proper names in Japan, but they couldn't be bothered to translate them to English. And they were originally 2 separate 3DS games, so it's nice to see them get a new lease of life and a wider release, even if the English physical is extremely niche and not particularly easy to get a hold of. The Tales of series is one of the classic JRPG staples. I have to admit, I've not delved into the series as much as I should, despite loving both Tales of Symphonia, Tales of Vesperia, and Abyss, which is not on the Switch, but thankfully the previous two are on the Switch, physically. Now, Symphonia did have some teething troubles and is considered to be worse than the original release, but hey, if you don't know any better, I suppose it's fine. Vesperia is a classic, and they just exemplified a youthful, adventurous feeling. Breezy, mostly optimistic, I love it. Tales of Grace's F remaster is one I have not played, but I am excited to since it retains that vibe before it went slightly edgy in recent games, and this one is releasing physically in January. Let's move on to Nippon Ichi Software and their North American branch, NIS America. Grab a coffee or something because this is going to be a long one. Nobody has pumped out as much as these guys. The Alliance Alive HD Remaster is a game that was originally a 3DS game that flopped hard because it was released a year after the Nintendo Switch was out. Crazy people. So that's why they ported it to the Switch to make sure they made some money back. It's a lovely looking game that's perhaps a bit simple. The scenario was written by the late Yoshitaka Murayama of Suikoden fame, and it's supposedly a decent time. The Legend of Legacy HD Remaster is a similar kind of game for the fact that it was also originally made for the dinky 3DS console and made by the same developers. However, it was an earlier game and lacked the polish and ambition of Alliance Alive, so it did suffer in reviews. I did play the Switch version for a short amount of time to sample it and found it to be interesting enough, but not something I would rush out to buy. Maybe if you're starting to scrape the barrels of top quality JRPGs, then maybe give this one a look. There are two Caligula Effect games on the Switch. The first game was originally released on the PlayStation Vita, but made its way to the Switch as the Caligula Effect Overdose. It is a remake that includes new gameplay, new protagonist, and new endings, so is the preferred way to go. Many say that this game was too much of a Persona wannabe, and yeah, maybe, but the sequel, the Caligula Effect 2, is supposedly a pretty decent improvement on the first game in terms of quality of life stuff, gameplay, and level design, although perhaps the story is not as good. At least that's what I've heard, I've not played them. Cry Machina is another game developed by Furyu, who you'd hope with the amount of games that they pump out, they'd be able to put more polish into fewer games compared to releasing 4 JRPGs a year. I digress. The story for this one is a bit cheesy but satisfying, and the gameplay can be a bit mindless button mashing-y, you know how it is. The fact that it's mostly glossed over in the PR says it all. But mostly, people seem to do enjoy this one, but it doesn't look like it's for me personally. Crystar, originally released only on PlayStation 4, and it always seemed like an odd omission to ignore the Switch, but it did eventually come to the Switch, and it's another action RPG developed by Furyu, and is, as far as I'm aware, the progenitor to Cry Machina. I don't believe they are directly related, but Cry Machina can be considered to be the spiritual successor to Crystar, so this is a bit more simple in every aspect. Destiny Connect TikTok Travelers is another NIS America JRPG that had all the potential to be great, but they've got deadlines, budgets, and salaries to pay, so it came out pretty mid. I reviewed this way back in the day, and you know what? I do look on it fondly. I have a little bit of nostalgia for it. It has some nice ideas, and it is a good introduction to the genre for a younger audience. I do like this one more than I probably should. It's short, it's a compact JRPG with a charming story and characters. What can I say? Maybe I'm easily pleased. If there is one series that NIS is known for, it is Disgaea. It's a series I enjoy, and they're probably the games that they put the most effort into. But I wish they'd spread the love to other series these days. It's either Disgaea or Random New Game. Rarely do we get sequels to their other classics. Anyways, there are a lot of Disgaea games on the Switch. 5, in fact. Disgaea 1 Complete, Disgaea 4 Complete Plus, Disgaea 5 Complete, Disgaea 6 Defiance of Destiny, and Disgaea 7 Vows of the Virtueless. Most of which you're gonna get a good strategy RPG time with. But I wouldn't worry too much about playing all of them, because if you played one, you've played them all kind of. And NIS humor can only, for me, it can only be enjoyed in small bursts. At least in my unfunny opinion. The only one you may want to avoid as your first is 6, which was when the series went 3D for the first time, and let's just say they had some teething issues. Fallen Legion Rise to Glory and its sequel, Fallen Legion Revenants, are not really my kind of RPG. I'm not always a fan of the side-on view. I think it loses a lot of immersion. But these are compared to Valkyrie Profile, which I also haven't played, but I have played Rise to Glory, and I'm sure some people will like the art style, a bit Vanillaware-esque, as well as the hectic action battles where each character has a button dedicated to them with a cooldown time and stuff. These are some of NIS's more obscure releases, but unlike some of their other obscure releases, these are still found reasonably priced. I don't think they sold particularly well. God Wars, The Complete Legend. The biggest claim for this one is that NIS America's license ran out, so they've had to delist the game from the eShop and they can't sell it anymore. But just before that ran out, they did a cheeky little reprint of the physical release, so you can still get that from outlets, especially Video Games Plus. This is another Final Fantasy Tactics wannabe. Of course, it's not as good, but I've heard it's fairly commendable. Labyrinth of Refrain, Coven of Dusk, and its sequel, Labyrinth of Galeria, The Moon Society, are two dungeon-crawling RPGs. The first game is loved a lot by enthusiasts of this particular subgenre. It manages to incorporate story, unlike its main competitor, Etrian Odyssey. It's a bit cheeky, but there are some good revelations, plenty of grinding and dungeons with gimmicks. The sequel is more of the same, but perhaps slightly more divisive, with some complaints about the lack of variety. I don't know, I've not played it myself. Langrissa 1 and 2 is a pretty hearty collection of strategy RPGs that back in the day were the main rival of Fire Emblem. This is a remake with new artwork, but you can switch back to the classic if you want to, and I would do that for the character artwork because you can't beat that classic 90s anime look. But yeah, these are beastly games with long-ass battles and good presentation. For a good while, the physical release was sold out and expensive as hell, but Video Games Plus helped reprint them, and now they still have some stock in at the time of writing. Don't miss it. The Legend of Heroes. Look, I don't even know where to start with these because there's just so many on the Switch, and it is nice to see. If you want excellent stories, world building, mechanics, and presentation, these are the best in the business made by Falcom. I've never played any of them as of yet because I'm waiting to see if the first game in the series comes to the Switch. Trails in the Sky, or at least Trails of Cold Steel 1. Sadly, there are no signs of an English release on the Switch of either of those, but there is good news with the fact that Trails in the Sky is getting a remake on the Switch next year, and although the physical release hasn't 100% been confirmed, it is highly likely. But anyways, let me just power through what's currently available on the Switch in English, okay? Physically. Legend of Heroes, Trails from Zero, Trails to Azure, Trails into Reverie, Trails of Cold Steel 3, Trails of Cold Steel 4, Trails through Daybreak, Trails through Daybreak 2, at least that one's coming in the future. I don't know, it's overwhelming, I've got no idea guys. If you're already invested in this series, they are essential, but it's hard to jump into the series without a good starting point because they are all connected. However, The Legend of Nayuta, The Boundless Trail, despite the name, isn't connected to the Trails of series, at least not officially yet. It is a standalone game as far as I know. It feels like a nice mix between the Trails of series and Falcom's other big franchise, Ys. It's action-orientated, has platforming elements, actually looks really good. I'm probably gonna play this one sooner rather than later. The Longest 5 Minutes was an earlier JRPG release on the Switch for NIS America. It's an intriguing game, mainly for its narrative structure where the whole game takes place during the last 5 minutes of the final boss battle. As your party is about to be defeated, you have flashbacks of your adventure up to this point. It's a simple, on-the-rails RPG, like each chapter is its own thing, but it's a really cool concept, not the best, but interesting. The Lost Child was originally a Vita dungeon crawler before making its way to the Switch. Pretty bog standard, more budgeted effort, but again, its claim to fame these days was that it's been delisted from the eShop, so if you want to play it, the physical release is the only way to go. Sadly, unlike God Wars, it was not reprinted, unless they're keeping it in a secret warehouse for a rainy day, I don't know, so prices are quite expensive these days. Monarch is another Furyu special with strategy RPG elements. Like most of their games, it was received as mid as my waistline. But I think gamers actually started to appreciate this one a bit more, a solid 7 out of 10 title, good characters, decent story, a bit like Shin Megami Tensei in that aspect, but with a basic battle system that maybe drags on a bit too long. Monster Menu, the Scavenger's Cookbook, is a strategy RPG, an all-you-can-eat adventure. This one really passed me by. I didn't actually realize it was an RPG, but it has roguelike elements in there, so I did consider throwing it out, but I'll not be judgmental. I'm pretty sure this game went under the radar for everyone else as well, since nobody talks about it. You can create your characters and explore dungeons looking for monsters to cook up and survive. NIS America have 3 double packs under the Prinny Presents banner. Prinny presents NIS America Classics Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3. Together, these include Soul Nomad, Phantom Brave, Makai Kingdom, ZHP Unlosing Ranger versus Dark Death Evil Man, and the best one, Volume 3, having La Pucelle Ragnarok and Rhapsody. So that's 6 games, all from, I would say, the best era of Nippon Ichi software. And speaking of Phantom Brave, look out guys, it's getting a sequel called Phantom Brave: The Lost Hero. Admittedly, when it was revealed, I wasn't particularly thrilled since the frame rate looked awful and the art style, let's just say it's taken a nosedive since the original. Why are we making a sequel that looks worse? I don't know. But my hot take should be put on ice because, many people are excited about it. I do enjoy the first game quite a lot, so yeah, I'll give it a go when it releases next year, in January. And going back to Rhapsody, the first game which was in Volume 3, later, NIS released the Mall Kingdom Chronicles, which contains Rhapsody 2 and 3. The second of which is a proper sequel to the first, while the third game is more like a collection of side stories set within the first and second games. They are so adorably cute and charming JRPGs. They have the depth of the puddle, but they are a really relaxing time. Reignatis is one of NIS America's latest JRPG publications. Once again developed by Furyu, and once again the critical reception has been rather lukewarm. It's set in the modern day, but with a twist that magic is a known quantity in the world. It literally just released as I am writing this and starting to record some bits, so I'll have to see what gamers' opinions are of it later on, once the dust has settled. Instead of just relying on their Japanese mother company and Furyu to provide the JRPGs, NIS America, they've also been kind enough to let you do the work too, since they've published 2 RPG Maker games. Firstly, RPG Maker MV, which was a long time ago, fairly solid, and very recently we've had RPG Maker With, called as much because it allows you to collaborate with other people around the world, sharing projects and working together to create your dream JRPG. They come with tons of stock assets, but they lack the flexibility of PC editions of the game, so these are definitely more for the hobbyist rather than, someone looking to sell a piece of software. The Cruel King and the Great Hero is a storybook JRPG and a sequel to a game that's not a JRPG at all. It's beautiful to look at, very simple to play, but it's all about the presentation and storytelling here. It's absolutely gorgeous and probably won't be high on many a hardcore JRPG fans' list of games to play, but if you're looking for an adventure that's a little bit different than your bog standard NIS anime JRPG, you should probably give this one a look. Savior of Sapphire Wings and Stranger of Sword City Revisited is hands down one of NIS America's more obscure releases. It literally feels they found these 2 games down the back of the sofa and decided to bundle them together. It is a long-winded title for 2 long-winded games. Lower budget dungeon crawling JRPGs that were originally on the Vita, I believe, simple but supposedly alright. Tokyo Xanadu EX Plus is a game from Falcom, and this is one that's been compared to their version of a Persona game. It has social links, it has anime storytelling, but this time it's an action game, and since it's Falcom, it works really well. It's a recent but popular release on the Switch, despite being an old-ish game overall. Ys is one of my favorite series that I've only played a bit of. A bit like the Legend of Heroes series, I want to play them in order in my own time, and thankfully, we are getting close to the reality on the Switch. Okay, you can't play the first or second game, at least not in English, but the third game is coming physically next year. Ys Memoir, The Oath in Felghana. It's a HD port of the remake of the third game. Ys 8, Lacrimosa of Dana, was the first on the Switch, and this is the first one that I played and I loved it. Loved the setting, loved the themes, loved the music. It's what made me want to go back and play the rest of the series. Ys 9, Monstrum Nox, followed a bit later and was supposedly a celebration of the franchise, culminating in a climax of Adol and his adventures so far. Can't personally verify that though, I've not played it. Ys 10, Nordics is definitely out, it just released as I'm recording this. The latest game in the series, but supposedly chronologically after the second game. So yeah, if you played Ys 1 and 2, you might want to jump into this one. This looks fantastic, well suited to the Switch, lots of action, lots of exploration. I can't wait to play it myself. Ys Origin is slightly the odd one out. It's a spin-off of the series and was not published by NIS America, but I'll squeeze it in here for the sake of flow. This is often considered low-key one of the best Ys games. Great combat and playability, looks great, and it's even better for fans of the first two games in the series due to the story connections. Let's jump into one of my favorite companies. Despite the majority of their existence in the digital era being filled to the brim with a mountain of DLC for any game that they can muster, Koei Tecmo, especially the former part of the company, played a huge part in my early teenage years on the PlayStation 2. Love those guys. And thankfully, despite the myriad of overpriced DLC bikini costumes, they still put out excellent games. In terms of JRPGs, alongside their Studio Gus, they've got some low-key, some of the best releases on the system. The Atelier series is perhaps their best known one these days. There are tons of them on the Nintendo Switch. They're often divided into sub-series, and perhaps the most popular of those is the Atelier Ryza series. All three Atelier Ryza games are on the system. We have the first game, Atelier Ryza, Ever Darkness and the Secret Hideout, which introduced us to the lovely Ryza and her charming friends. It was followed by The Alchemist of the Mysterious Dream, and then recently we had a send-off with Atelier Ryza 3, Alchemist of the End, and The Secret Key. Atelier Yumiya is coming in March next year. Strangely, the Switch physical release is only happening in North America. Europe will have to import a copy if they want it on the Switch physically. I made a video a while ago with a theory as to why, if you want to watch that to check out my mad crazy thoughts about it. The Atelier Dusk Trilogy Deluxe Pack is one of the most popular imports of all time for good reason, because this Asian release is the only way to get 3 Atelier games physically in English. This pack contains Atelier Aisha, Shaylee, and Esha and Logi, 3 in 1. Just do not buy the Japanese versions because those do not have English. Only the Southeast Asian triple pack does. It is pricey, but 3 chunky JRPGs on 1 sweet cartridge. The Atelier Mysterious Trilogy Deluxe Pack is a similar sort of deal. Asian only release, which has English. It has 3 games, but it's the only way to get an English physical for 2 of them. Since one of the games in this package, Lydia and Suel, did get a Western physical release early in the Switch's life. So it's been less desirable for the higher price, but still the only way to get Atelier Ferris and Atelier Sophie physically with English. Speaking of Sophie, the West was blessed with a physical release of Atelier Sophie 2, The Alchemist of the Mysterious Dream. This was a surprise sequel for me, felt more like a filler release between the Ryza games, but it was a really nice game, and a lot of people have said it's one of their favorite games in the series. Rounding off the Atelier series, we have 2 more. Atelier Lulua, the Scion of Ireland, is the one that's most forgotten about. Again, it came after the first Ryza game, which was a great evolution in the series, whereas Lulua was a bit more stuck in the older style, so that's why people didn't talk about it as much. And finally, but not probably forever, since I'm sure we're going to have even more on the Switch in the future, there's the Atelier Marie remake, The Alchemist of Solberg, which is a remake of the very first game in the series. This makes it far more quaint than the current batch of Atelier games. It's way more old school and much less of a proper JRPG adventure, but it is a JRPG. The physical release for this, if you want the English version, you need to get the Southeast Asian release. Moving away from Atelier, we have the Blue Reflection Second Light. This is another game from the same developers as the Atelier series, Gust. It's the second game in the Blue Reflection series. Sadly, the first game never made it to the console, but this very much looks and feels like an Atelier game, but in a more modern setting with some magical elements. Basically, Japanese schoolgirl lesbians save the world against God, or something like that. Fairy Tail is best known for the anime series, of which I know nothing about, but what I do know is that there is a JRPG on the Nintendo Switch, and it's pretty good. Although perhaps a bit impenetrable if you're not familiar with the series. But then again, there is an incredibly hot anime babe there, and then you realize it doesn't matter, just play it. It looks good, and the systems are competent, and it's a decent time. Later this year, it's getting a sequel, Fairy Tail 2, which surprised me. I didn't realize the first game was popular enough, but hey, it's something to look forward to, and hopefully it's even better than the first. Now, how about we move on to the big N themselves? No, not Nolan North or Nick Nolte, I'm talking about Nintendo, because they are pretty serious about JRPGs. Maybe not in the standard anime way that you may be used to, or what you'd expect, but they do have plenty to offer. Fire Emblem has gone from being one of Nintendo's most niche series to almost breaking into the mainstream. Fire Emblem Three Houses brought it up to big AAA JRPG strategy game standards. Nintendo actually brought in Koei to assist with this title and make it, grander in scale compared to what Intelligent Systems may have been used to working on more portable systems. I think it was a good partnership that many say is one of the best and most complete games on the system. Fans of the old school editions may not like the modernization as much, but that's just what happens. Fire Emblem Engage was released last year, 4 years after Three Houses. This was less well received due to having a poorer story and feeling less epic overall, but the combat was praised, often being stated as the best in the series, and probably more satisfying for older Fire Emblem fans. Personally, I just can't get over the main character's designs. Yes, I can be that shallow. Miitopia is certainly one of Nintendo's left field choices for a JRPG. It was originally a 3DS game and plays more like a combination of the Tomodachi Life mixed with a comedy RPG, as you kind of make the characters yourself. You can make your mum the evil villain that she obviously is. It's worth it for a few laughs. Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door is the only Paper Mario game in the series that's physical on the Switch that most people would state is a JRPG. I haven't played Origami King, but I believe it's still part of the newer focus of the series where it's less like a JRPG. I don't know, feel free to correct me on that one, but there is a reason Thousand Year Door is considered to be the best in the series and one of the best games ever made, not only as an RPG. Pokemon is a huge series for Nintendo. They can fart these out without much effort and still make billions of dollars. And let's face it, even some of the lower effort releases are still pretty good, all things considered. I mean, myself and my daughter playing together probably put in 100 hours into the Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl remakes. A lot of people look down on these, but I think they're fantastic. Now let's just plow through the rest of the Pokemon games, because there's a lot of them. We have Pokemon Sword and Shield, which were the brand new generation on the console. These flirted with the idea of more open areas, and it was a step in the right direction. We also got another generation in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, but these went full open world. Another nice step in the right direction, if very, very flawed, not least technically. One of the best introductions to the JRPG genre would be the two Pokemon Let's Go games, Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee. I know these are derided by most hardcore Pokemon fans, but you know what, they are perfect to get younger kids into the franchise. This was the first game my daughter ever played and she loved it, and she's well on her way to being a proper gamer. I kinda wish they would do another Let's Go game, like Let's Go Johto or something. Simple catching mechanics, easy co-op play so we can play together, good times, like really, really good times. And finally, there is a unique spin-off in Pokemon Legends Arceus, which was an experimental stepping stone to take the franchise kind of off the rails. I think they learned a lot from this to make Scarlet and Violet. Now, full disclosure, I haven't actually played this one. It's the only one I haven't actually found the time for, but it's the one I'm most interested in. I think hardcore Pokemon fans appreciated this one a bit more than the other games on the Switch, and it must have done well enough that there is a sequel coming next year. It almost certainly will have a physical release, but since it's not like 100% confirmed, I won't officially count it for this video, because you never know. Super Mario RPG was originally a Super Nintendo JRPG made by Square and considered to be one of the more unique games on that system's library. Regarded as a bit of a classic, this has had a severe glow-up on the Nintendo Switch, retaining mostly the same gameplay. It just looks far more crystal clear, and it's nice to have a more accessible way to play the game. It did well, selling even more than the original game, which is a nice way to earn profit from 30 years ago. Xenoblade has defied all odds and become Nintendo's premier JRPG franchise, at least in terms of genre purity. And to think Nintendo didn't really want to publish the original in the West on the Wii, I'm glad they did, because what a series this is. Incredibly epic games with great gameplay and a fantastic focus on the story, and somehow they managed to pump them out every couple of years. This is how modern AAA JRPGs should have evolved. This is the right evolutionary line, starting with Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition, which is a remake of the original Wii game and retains all the good stuff but now looks incredible and includes an after story to tie things off nicely. It is essential. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was released on the Switch before that though, and it was the cherry on top of the first incredible year of the Nintendo Switch's life. Okay, looking back now, it's clear to see the gotcha blade system and the comical anime character designs may have been a slight sidestep rather than a step forward, but there's no denying it's still an excellent game to have in your JRPG library. This was followed pretty soon by an expansion pass DLC story content, which also got its own physical release, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 Torna the Golden Country, which can be played by itself. It reworks some of the gameplay of Chronicles 2 and includes its own unique elements. It stands on its own as a proper game, about a third of the length of the proper entry, but that's still a meaty game. Some say it's even better than 2 in its own way, but you probably do need to play 2 first to contextualize a lot of the characters and connections. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 released in 2022, and I would guess it will be the final Xenoblade game on the system, at least a new one. I have a sneaking suspicion they'll be saving number 4 for the launch window of the Switch 2. I think this was regarded as a return to the right direction of the original. I have not had the time to play this one as of yet, but it's considered to be one of the best JRPGs of its generation. And all 3, or 4, or 5 games in the series should be in your collection. The only thing that's missing is Xenoblade X, which is a Wii U game. I would love to see that back. Oh wait, sorry. Oh, I needed to edit that now since the Mad Lads have only gone and announced it. Yes, as I was recording this, Xenoblade Chronicles X has been announced to be getting a physical release on Nintendo Switch in March next year. It's a long time to wait, at least from my point of view, but as potentially the best Wii U game, I'll be happy to dive back into this one. It's not quite like the other games in the series. It's definitely its own thing, hence the X rather than a number, so don't go in with the same expectations, and you'll still enjoy kicking ass with mechs and badass music. Tokyo Mirage Sessions Sharp FE Encore is for me a very underappreciated JRPG made by Atlus exclusively for Nintendo. It featured the Fire Emblem franchise mixed in with a Persona or SMT-like game. I thought comboing attacks was a lot of fun in this game, and it did die on its arse on the Wii U, and I hoped more people would pay attention to it on its second life on Nintendo Switch, but I don't think they did. We don't hear much about it these days. They don't talk about sales figures or anything like that, and I think it's a shame because it really is an awesome JRPG. I highly recommend it. Speaking of Atlus, of Persona, and of Shin Megami Tensei, let's move on to said company and their parent company, Sega. Always a delight, and of course, while it took a while for things to get moving on the system, they've slowly opened up and we are getting some really nice JRPGs. Etrian Odyssey Origins Collection is a fantastic triple pack of some of the best dungeon crawling JRPGs money can buy. While they are certainly not original in their approach, they took the formula and popularized it, allowing many other companies to have the confidence to do the same. This contains enhanced ports of the original 3 games, sadly not including the remake content that was on the 3DS, but still, they managed to transition the map making aspect really well. 3 JRPGs in one, so you're getting like 100 hours worth of content here. The physical release for this was only in Asia and Japan, but you do not want the Japanese one because that one does not have English. Only the Asian and the Korean version have English, and it is one of the most popular imports of all time. Persona is probably Atlus's premier JRPG series these days, despite being a spin-off It seems way more popular than Shin Megami Tensei. There are 5 physical Persona games on the Switch, starting with Persona 3 Portable. This was done physically by Limited Run Games in North America, and that's it. There is no other place to get this physically. This is a port of the PSP edition, which stripped out a lot of what I love about the game, mostly the lack of exploration. But it's still a fine JRPG and set the framework for the series going forward with social links and the like. Persona 4 Golden is where it's at for me though. Despite being the portable edition, it actually added content rather than took it away, and it's one of the best JRPGs ever made, with a fantastic mystery story, amazing characters, and addictive social links that makes you want to be as complete as possible, getting to know the characters well, maximizing your abilities and money by taking on part-time jobs, doing exams at school while dungeon crawling. It's just one of the best JRPGs I've ever played. Sadly, the physical release for this was also done by Limited Run Games in North America. If you missed it, life sucks. Persona 5 Royal is the latest game in the series, and I know some would argue it's the best in the series. I wouldn't know, to be honest, I haven't played it, but it took its sweet time to get on the console, with the main character appearing in Smash Bros. Long before this port was even announced. I think we all knew something fishy was going on. Anyways, it's one of the essential JRPGs you should own on the system. The Switch port is actually supposed to be really good as well. Now, Atlus have been known to milk their mainline games, and Persona 5 has had 2 spin-offs on the Nintendo Switch, neither of which are pure JRPGs, but close enough, maybe. I'm going to include them anyways. The more recent one being Persona 5 Tactica, a tactical RPG. It's a bit like XCOM or the Mario and Rabbids series, supposed to be pretty decent from what I've heard. But before that, even before Persona 5, the mainline game, was on the Switch, we got Persona 5 Strikers. Initially, I would not have put this on the list due to it being labeled as a Masu game, like a, Dynasty Warriors, but it's supposedly much more than that. Firstly, it is a direct sequel to Persona 5, and it has just about everything aside from the social links, which one may argue is a big part of the series, but for all intents and purposes, no one seems to dispute this as an RPG. Let me know in the comments for sure, because I haven't played it myself. I'm just going on what I've read online. Shin Megami Tensei is the mainline series where Persona spinned off from, but I think it's fair to say it's not Atlus's main focus these days. These are more darkly games, far less hip and cool, but they definitely please the hardcore fans. On the Switch, it all started with a random port of Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne HD Remaster. Why this one? I don't know, maybe it was the easiest to port, but many have stated it wasn't exactly a great port, losing a lot of the atmosphere, but it did add an easier option for the notoriously difficult combat. Another good thing is that the physical for this is pretty much always dirt cheap these days, and still well worth the price. Shin Megami Tensei 5 was a big announcement for the Switch. I believe it was the last game to release that was revealed alongside the Switch. It took a while, but this Nintendo Switch console exclusive is widely considered to be the best one on the system. A very focused JRPG, having all the monster baiting and a heavy story. When it released on the Switch in 2021, it was considered to be many people's game of the year, although you probably wouldn't want to pick it up anymore. In fact, you'd be very misguided to purchase one of the best JRPGs on the system. Why? Well, because earlier this year we got Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance, which is essentially the same game. It includes the same story with some tweaks to the gameplay, but it also includes a completely separate and brand new story that you can also play. You can choose pretty much at the beginning of the story like which one you want to experience, and while I haven't had the chance to let this release devour my soul as of yet, I'm pretty sure they are vastly different in terms of narrative, not just minor things. You can play both back to back and not feel like you're running over well-trodden ground, and even better, it's also on other consoles so you can play it at a reasonable frame rate. Unicorn Overlord wasn't made by Atlus, but they published it in Japan. This is a game I was eyeing up for a long time. Due to literal life, I have not had the time to play it yet, but from the moment it was unveiled, you could see it was Vanillaware's most ambitious title to date. Like something you could feel couldn't be made this day and age. It's something that would be made on the Sega Saturn and left only in Japan. I'm talking about Dragon Force, but that did get a Western release, so what am I talking about? However, now it's even more modern and epic, although it does apparently have a popular character called Rosalind, which is a cursed name for me now. I mean, I'm a fan of the TV show Taskmaster. If you know, you know. Outside of Atlus proper, their overlords at Sega aren't known from shying away from a JRPG once in a while. Sadly, we're still waiting for that Port of Skies of Arcadia, the best JRPG ever made, but they still have a couple that you may want to have a look at. The Valkyria Chronicles series isn't like a standard JRPG. In fact, I'm a little bit on the fence as to whether to include it or not, but they are awesome games that should be played, and JRPG fans will no doubt enjoy them a lot, so I'm going to shove them in this list anyway. Firstly, Valkyria Chronicles 4, that was the first one in the series on the Switch physically, very early on. It cost me an arm and a leg to get a physical copy here, where I live in China, since they mostly have the Japanese versions, which doesn't have English. But tangents aside, this is a fantastic blend of turn-based and real-time strategy RPG combat with a bit of first-person shooting to go along with it. I think this is a really excellent and unique game that you should give a try. Very recently, Limited Run Games announced a new edition called the Valkyria Chronicles 4 Complete Edition, which includes all the main DLC on the cartridge, and they've just started taking pre-orders as I am recording this, but it ain't cheap. Much later, we finally got confirmation of Valkyria Chronicles, the original one, getting a physical release on the Switch. This was released digitally, I believe, at the same time as Chronicles 4, but was exclusive to the eShop for like 7 years or something crazy. Sadly, it takes limited run to make physicals of this happen. Pre-orders closed quite a while back, and at the time of writing this, they haven't been produced yet, so when they do, companies like VGP may have some leftover stock. Just check the generic link below and search for Valkyria Chronicles. Shining Resonance Refrain was one of the early JRPGs on the Switch within the first year or so, I believe. It's supposed to be decent, but I think most people kind of wished it resembled the Shining series of old rather than the modern adaptation. And the fact that this is the final mainline game in a very long running and healthy series, I don't think it landed as well as Sega hoped. But speaking of classics in that series, did you know that the Sega Genesis Classics Collection includes Phantasy Star 2, Phantasy Star 3, Phantasy Star 4, Shining in the Darkness, Shining Force 1 and 2, making this package worth it for those games alone. 6 nice JRPGs alongside the endless platformers and beat-em-ups. I know this release got some stick for its latency or delayed inputs, whatever you call it, but these turn-based games, that's not really an issue. Now this is being delisted. The digital version is being delisted from all digital stores, so you might want to grab the physical version just for, preservation's sake. Alright, let's move on to one of my favorite mid-tier publishers, Pqube, the company forever exploiting cheap Indonesian developers for nice indie games, while also scouring Japan for some untranslated hidden gem JRPGs. Class of Heroes 1 and 2 is a recent double pack of dungeon crawling JRPGs that were originally PSP games. Very niche, even on the PSP, but it's nice to see that they've come together for an affordable double pack on the Switch, the physical of which is going kinda cheap these days. They are tough games and you need to be very prepared, but I do enjoy the schooling aspect to the games, which makes them stand out as more unique compared to the usual fantasy type jubbo. Kowloon High School Chronicle, I guess, is a similar type of thing, so maybe I'm talking nonsense. It's a dungeon crawling JRPG that's originally from 2004 on the PlayStation 2, but this Switch edition is the first time it's been in English, and for me, even though I've not played it, I'm already in love with the aesthetic. It still looks like a PS2 game, which means that it may be the best game on this list. Okay, maybe not, but there is treasure hunting aspect to this alongside the high school setting. The publisher really dug deep to unearth this gem from Japan, and if I ever become a publisher myself, I would love to find more games like this. The physical release for this was only in Europe, but it's dirt cheap to get, so get it. Labyrinth of Zangetsu, again, a first-person dungeon-crawling JRPG. These things are just so popular. And the gimmick for this one is just the incredible art style. Black and white ink with a smidge of color, very striking. Now this one was not as well received as others in the genre. The biggest criticism is down to the weird mechanic where your stats may go down as you level up. I haven't played it myself, so I don't know if it is actually as terrible as it sounds, but it's supposedly purposeful, but some people still hate it because they want to see numbers go up, not down. Maglam Lord is an action RPG with a heavy amount of visual novel storytelling, which, to be honest, doesn't work for me in my JRPGs. I prefer proper cutscenes even if the characters are standing around like jackasses. I find it far more immersive than hand-drawn PNGs swooping in and out, but the consensus is that the V-end parts look stunning, while the action elements are a bit basic and undercooked. Metal Max Xeno Reborn is the latest game in the series that has very rarely made it outside of Japan, and that's another reason I appreciate Pqube, allowing us a glimpse into Japan that we otherwise haven't gotten before. This series is where a JRPG meets Mad Max, post-apocalyptic JRPG where you ride ramshackle machines and fight mutated monsters. It looks simple and isn't exactly hugely regarded, mainly because this reborn version streamlined a lot of the fat from the original version. Much less story, making it almost non-existent, which is a weird choice. They also completely changed the battle system, which some people either prefer or they hate. Let's move on to Eastasiasoft, a company I am fond of. Many of their physical releases are in partnership with PlayAsia, often but not exclusively to their website. They have plenty of JRPGs, and most of them are on the saucy side of things. If you want big boobs, questionable minigames, and more fan service than you know what to do with, they are probably your kind of publisher. But let's start with a bit more dignity. The Shen Sword series is a recent introduction to me. Not JRPGs since they were made in Taiwan, but they were, in that scene at that time, Very much doing the same sort of thing Square was doing, but on a much smaller budget. Starting with Shen Sword, Mist Beyond the Mountains, this is the third mainline game in the series, which is when the game started to be more than just a demo type of thing. This is an epic RPG that spans across the world from Italy to China and the Tang Dynasty. There are plenty of supernatural things going on, and you can see the influence of old Chinese texts that have had on the story, like Journey to the West nonsense in full swing, but they do make an interesting narrative out of it. The combat is traditional, and I think it looks great to this day. Some people complained about the translation, but I don't think it was too bad. It was released physically only in North America, but there is also an Asian physical release coming as well. Shen Sword 7 is the latest game in the series, and this is only tangentially an RPG. It's a bit more like a Dark Souls game. It's included here more for its legacy, but this is a really nice looking game, maybe less so on the Switch, but I think it's a commendable port. They did a good job with storytelling and voice acting. I've only played it for a short amount of time, but I definitely want to play it more. Again, it's got those supernatural elements, but now with slow, tough action combat. The physical release for this was exclusive to PlayAsia, but it was very, very popular and sold out really quickly. We'll have to see if it gets a reprint. Tokyo Clanpool is the latest JRPG physical they've taken pre-orders for over on PlayAsia. This was previously a Japanese-only Vita game. I believe it was one of the last on the system. And with the Vita well and truly dead in the West by that point, there was little chance of it getting a Western release. But now, late into the Switch's life, Tokyo Clanpool is getting its Western debut. It's a first-person dungeon-crawling JRPG with a heavy dose of moege, as you are a teenage girl who is the mayor of Tokyo and has to fight off demons to protect the city. It makes sense. Again, it's a PlayAsia exclusive. They currently still have the standard and collector's editions available at the time of writing, and they haven't sent it out as of yet, but I think they will soon. I think they said December. Twin Blades of the Three Kingdoms is a game where you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, because on the surface it looks like an RPG Maker game where little to no effort was put into disguising it, but I actually think it's a really decent game. Do you remember Destiny of an Emperor on the NES? It's like that, only properly balanced as a game and with a story. It takes the Three Kingdoms lore and does its own thing with it. I gave the game a whole segment to itself when I did a giant Three Kingdoms retrospective on my other channel, A Bit More Jordan, so if you want to learn more, go watch that. The physical for this is a PlayAsia exclusive, and they still have some standard editions as well as collector's editions available. 7 Pirates H is another one you shouldn't judge immediately. So what if you fiddle with boobs to make them shrink or grow to change the girl's stats? Behind the fan service blushing, there's actually a pretty decent JRPG in here. The story is rubbish, like absolutely garbage. The budget is non-existent, but the battle system has a lot of thought put into it. It's very commendable. Again, it's a PlayAsia exclusive, but there's only standard editions of it left. The Mugen Soul series debuted on the PlayStation 3, even landing in the West via NIS America. However, those were heavily censored, gutting out complete minigames in order to get approval for a retail release. However, Eastasiasoft have saved the day with the Switch versions, which are the original Japanese editions now with English, so you can play the game as intended. There's Mugen Souls and Mugen Souls Z, and they are pretty much the exact same experience, just with a different nonsensical story. Still, lots of effort put into them, especially the complicated battle systems. These are both Play Asia exclusives, both separate in standard and limited editions, which are still available. Just be warned though, do not buy the Japanese physical since they do not have English. Empire of Angels 4 is less saucy, but the fact that the game only has females in this world, there is a certain bit of fan service about it. Once again, this is also a case of don't judge a book by its cover, because this is a strategy RPG that's pretty well put together despite the overtly chibi visuals. The battles are nicely set out and offer a good challenge. This was once again a Play Asia exclusive, but only the standard edition is currently available anymore. Moero Crystal H is one of the most popular imports of all time, since the Play Asia exclusive Eastasiasoft release is the only way to get it in English. Again, it's one of those first-person dungeon crawlers where the story is of minimal importance compared to the gameplay. The gimmick for this is that all the enemies are shaped like cock and balls or boobs, and the characters are scantily clad, so it's a specialist release. Despite this, the actual game mechanics are quite competent. Moero Chronicle Hyper actually came out before that, and it doesn't have much to do with Eastasiasoft as far as I know, but I'll stick it here for the sake of not getting confusing. This was released only in North America physically via limited run games. Okay, let's move on to one of my least favorite JRPG publishers, Idea Factory. A few of their games have been done by Eastasiasoft for Play Asia, and they are mostly the ones that I do actually like, the ones that I can tolerate. But the ones that have gone to retail, I don't know, they are just not my kind of games. I find the stories incredibly shallow, the humor very basic, and the production value to be overly cheap, and then they want $60 for it. But that's just my opinion. Here we go. Idea Factory. Arc of Alchemist is one of the lowest rated JRPGs on the Nintendo Switch. I mean, the Metacritic score for the Switch version is 36, which I think that takes some serious effort. The physical release for this was done by Limited Run, only in North America. There is a Japanese physical, but that does not have English. There are 3 Death End Request games on the Switch. Well, 2 currently, but there is another one that's already been confirmed for a physical release. There's Death End Request, Death End Request 2, and Death End Request Code Z. These are horror-themed JRPGs with elements of visual novel due to the sheer amount of character sprites jumping in and out with the extensive story sections. Dragon Star Veneer is supposed to be one of Idea Factory's better releases. It had a really unique 3-tiered battle system and some rather, shall we say, appealing character designs. It's Idea Factory playing to their strengths. I just hope it lives up to the promise of having dragons covered in wood veneer. Like an Atari 2600, that would be badass. Fairy Fencer F Advent Dark Force and Fairy Fencer F Refrain Chord are 2 games in the same series, although they play very differently from each other. One is a standard JRPG kind of thing, while the other is a strategy RPG, a bit like Fire Emblem. I've only played the latter for a short amount of time, and in my opinion it was okay. I hated the story because it was humor for simpletons, but the gameplay was alright in the short amount of time I played it. All 3 Mary Skelter games are available on the Nintendo Switch, spread over 2 cartridges. Although hardly shouted from the rooftops, Mary Skelter 2 includes a remake of the first Mary Skelter game called Mary Skelter Nightmare. Sadly, the only English version of this was released by Limited Run a long time ago, so if you want it, you'll have to pay over the odds for it. Again, the series is supposed to be one of Idea Factory's better offerings, so I would probably give this package a go if I found it for a good price. Mary Skelter Finale got a retail release in both North America and Europe. This is the final game in the series and does include story roundups for the first 2 games if you don't manage to get the Mary Skelter 2 package. So that's nice of them. They knew it would be rare. Now, the Neptunia series is the one that I think pushed me over the edge when it came to having an opinion on Idea Factory. I know some people love the series, and that's fine. Some kids do bump their heads more than others, I don't blame you, but it's one of Idea Factory's biggest franchises. I don't understand why, but it means there's a lot of them on the Switch. Just to go over them very briefly: Neptunia Game Maker Revolution, Neptunia Cross Senran Kagura Ninja Wars, Neptunia Sisters vs. Sisters, and Super Neptunia RPG all got physical releases in both North America and Europe, but Mega Dimension Neptunia 7 only got a physical release in North America because it was with limited run games. I would not be surprised if we got more of this series in the future because Japan has way more already, like remakes of the earlier games fans in the West are salivating for. Or maybe they just do that naturally, I'm never sure. Record of Agarest War only got a physical release in North America. This is a strategy RPG that was doing the breeding generational thing far before Fire Emblem made it popular, although this has even more fan service if you can believe that. I actually like the visuals for this one. It's an older game and doesn't feel like they cheapened out as much back then. Let's move on to a company who I don't think would ever say they are a fully JRPG company. Marvelous and their North American counterpart Exceed are known more for their farming sims, but they do dabble in a bit of action RPG goodness here and there. Farmagia is their big upcoming game releasing in November. This was announced in a direct, and I have to admit, I burst out laughing when I heard the name. I have no idea why they made it sound like some Italian cheese, but the gameplay looks interesting, despite me already foreseeing the Nintendo Switch's framerate crippling. You get a big army of monsters by your side as you do some farming. In fact, you actually farm the monsters to help you. Kind of weird, but interesting as well. Loop 8 Summer of Gods looked like an absolutely amazing game when it was originally announced. Unfortunately, it went down like a lead balloon upon release. In fact, this may go down as a modern Kosoge, where things are inexplicably bad. Like, it looks great, it sounds great, but it comes together into a mushy nonsense. At least that is what I've heard from reviews. Needless to say, I rushed out to buy it myself to find out one day. Currently, alongside the Story of Seasons series, Marvelous's biggest franchise is Rune Factory. And this is definitely within the realms of action RPG, as you farm, but also delve into dungeons to try and defeat monsters. There are romancing aspects too, and it's essentially just Story of Seasons, but with added monster murder. There are currently 3 Rune Factory games on the Switch physically, and 1 on the way. Personally, I would recommend Rune Factory 3 Special and Rune Factory 4 Special. These are HD ports of a DS and 3DS game, and they are the pinnacle of the series, getting the balance perfectly right. Okay, they may not look super great on modern consoles, but they are still good games. At the time of writing, Rune Factory 5 is the latest in the series, and it's safe to say that the game did not evolve as hoped. I don't think the developers were prepared for HD development with bigger ambition. I'm not saying to avoid it, but it's definitely lower priority. Coming soon, or at least next year, is Rune Factory Guardians of Azuma, which looks like a much needed evolution of the series, making it look even more JRPG than ever. It has a much more distinctive visual flavor, and hopefully can be the true HD experience that fans of the franchise have been hoping for, at least on this console generation. Silent Hope may have been hoped to launch a brand new franchise, but I don't think it quite worked thanks to mediocre reviews for this one. It's a simple action RPG that people thought, had simplicity of a mobile game with basic combat. There are 7 job types, which is probably the biggest pull, and if you want an RPG where you don't have to think about anything, just hacking and slashing without much of a story, then it may be okay for a discounted price. Trinity Trigger again didn't exactly set the world alight. It's a budgeted action RPG sold for a premium price. This one did fare a little bit better thanks to the Secret of Mana style co-op action and the experienced developers behind it, but it lacks in story, depth and production values. Also, playing with AI companions is supposed to be painful, so definitely make sure you team up with a sibling or your mum to play this one. Speaking of budget, it is time to have a little focus on the kings of budgeted JRPGs themselves, Kemco. It's a brand with a reputation, and I think it's a little bit harsh. Yes, you can expect mobile JRPGs, but for one, they're mostly decent, never really horrible, and amongst those, they have put out some nice, bigger games as well. If you have watched my Let's Get Physical series, or if you've been keeping up with the import releases, you will know that by now there are 8 volumes of the Kemco RPG selections on the Nintendo Switch. These have released in Japan, and many of them in Asian regions too. Each volume contains 4 cheaper JRPGs that do play in English, so if you do the math, 8 volumes times by 4 games, that's 32 JRPGs. So if you're wondering how the number on this video got jacked up, thank Kemco. What I do adore about these collections is that they have their own color, and they're very uniform, so it feels like collecting a series of old ass books or something. And while there are currently only 8 volumes on the Switch, the console has been trying to catch up with the PlayStation 4, which has 12. And I have no doubt they will join the ranks in the future. They usually pump out like 3 or 4 a year by this point, so by the end of 2025, I expect to have the full 12 volume set. Unless there's even more. But that's not all, because there was a rogue Kemco RPG Omnibus release exclusive to Asian regions, and this contains 4 games that you can find spread over those 8 volumes. It's definitely a random release, and if you have the other collections, you don't need this one, except it's usually incredibly cheap, so maybe, up to you. They also had some pointless releases partnering with limited run games, so if you specifically only care about ESRB releases, then you may want to take a look at Revenant Saga and Revenant Dogma, a double pack, or perhaps Alphadia Genesis 1 and 2 double pack, or even the As Divine Collection, which is a quad pack. All of these are or will be in those Japanese collections I've already mentioned, and available for a much more reasonable price with far more content. So these really are only for ESRB collectors. So Kemco have had a lot of budgeted JRPGs, but I would like to draw your attention to Cross Tales, which for me is a very underrated tactical RPG. It's a game that's let down by a stiff translation, but this import exclusive physical release is a really good game. If you miss Final Fantasy Tactics, of all the copycats I know about, this is the one I think really gets close to what made it so great. It's got all the hallmarks aside from good dialogue. Maybe the original script was naff for all I know, but I do recommend importing this. It's usually only like 25 bucks or something like that, which I think is great. And moving away from Kemco, let's stick with the same developer, because the developer of Cross Tales also has its own little series going on of other commendable tactical RPGs. There are so many Mercenaries games that it's tough to keep track of them all, but I guess that's my job. So at the time of writing, there are 5 Mercenaries cartridges on the Nintendo Switch. Which order they are in, who knows? Oh wait, I do, because I spent 5 minutes checking. Firstly, there was Mercenaries SaGa Chronicles, which is actually a triple pack. It contains the first 3 games in the series, which started live on the 3DS eShop. Then there was Mercenaries Wings The False Phoenix, which is more of the same. Then Mercenaries Blaze Dawn of the Twin Dragons with incremental improvements. The 6th game in the series was Mercenaries Rebirth Call of the Wild Lynx, which is great because it's got a lynx in the title. Lynx are really underrated animals, at least in the top 10. The 7th and most recent physical release is Mercenaries Lament Requiem of the Silver Wolf. Wolves are pretty cool too, but not as cool as lynxes. It's fair to say that the series gets better and more confident as time goes on, but still, I think Cross Tales is a better introduction. It's worth noting that these were only released physically in North America, no European release. I don't know why. Let's keep the connection going here, okay? Since these games were published physically by PM Studios, who like to dabble in JRPGs from time to time, and they had a recent one in Witch Spring R. This is a remake of the first Witch Spring game, which was a cutesy mobile RPG, and I tell you what, while you can tell it was originally made for a dinkier system, it's really good. It's a proper RPG with good production, cute characters, and fun gameplay design. I do recommend it. But that wasn't the first Witch Spring game on the Switch though, since a few years beforehand there was Witch Spring 3 Refine. Again was a port of a mobile game, and while this still has that feeling a lot more than Witch Spring R, just don't discount it, okay? If you like the Atelier games from Koei, then you'll probably also enjoy this. It's from a top-down perspective, and it has a few streamlined mechanics, but it is fun, and I do recommend giving it a try. I'm out of connections, so let's just go on to a random game. The Alchemist of Ars Magna is a very recent release on Nintendo Switch. It is primarily a visual novel, like 90% visual novel, but there are JRPG elements in here too, with dungeon crawling on a board game-like map and first-person combat. Don't purchase this game if you're buying it primarily for JRPG, because you will not enjoy it. This is primarily for visual novel fans first, and then JRPG is just like the bonus feature. The physical release for this was only in Japan, but it does have English. Aria Chronicle is a game that's not thought about much. It's an import-exclusive physical release that does have English, but since its first release, I don't believe it's had a reprint. It mixes classic fantasy with the dungeon crawling aspects found in something like Darkest Dungeon. It's certainly one that almost nobody paid attention to, aside from myself. Brave Dungeon W Pack is a triple pack of JRPGs, mini in scale, a couple of which were originally made for the 3DS eShop, which tells you all about the scope. But this also includes a newer game. Together you get Brave Dungeon, the Meaning of Justice, and Dark Witch's Story Combat. Fun, cute games. The physical release was only in Japan, but it does have English. Brigandine, The Legend of Runercia, is a strategy game with RPG elements in there as you try to unify the land with knights and monsters fighting your battles for you. The original game is a cult classic on PS1, and this is supposed to be a very nice follow-up. It was also developed by Matrix Software, who made Alundra, so I want to play it for that alone. Cards RPG The Misty Battlefield is a strategy RPG with deck building elements. I think a chunk of puke just went in my mouth right now. And throwing my bias aside, the game does have mixed reviews. Despite some really neat visuals, the mechanics of all your troops sharing one deck of cards was perplexing, but I believe they patched and tweaked that game now, so everyone has their own deck. The physical release for this is an import exclusive, but it does have English. Cosmic Fantasy Collection was done by Limited Run in North America. It's the only version that has English with it. And these are two rough around the edges early JRPGs. The main gimmick being that it was had loads of anime cutscenes. Gameplay wise, they weren't the greatest, and the first game feels more like a proof of concept than a finished product, but the second game is where it starts to get good. Limited Run did announce that they will do Cosmic Fantasy Collection 2, which contains 3 more games, and it's when the series really starts to get good. When will they do this? I don't know, but it has been announced, so maybe in 10 years, who knows? Undernaughts Labyrinth of Yomi is a really interesting dungeon crawling RPG. They have a case of we've seen this before syndrome with these kind of games because, yeah, there are a lot of them very similar in terms of gameplay, but this one has always stuck out to me due to the setting and the characters. It's often really expensive though, which is its biggest hurdle. Monyu is another first-person dungeon crawler. It actually has a ridiculously long title. It is developed by the same people as Undernaughts, but this is a very different feeling. It's not dark and moody. One of the gimmicks this game has, aside from the ridiculous name, is that your equipment can gain experience and level up too. Nice. Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation Quest of Memories is again a dungeon crawling game. However, this adds in a couple of things to make it stand out differently. Firstly, the visual novel style storytelling, and then with the business management section. It's based on an anime, and it is advised to have watched up to the 3rd season to know what's going on, and also to not be spoiled. The physical release for this was only in Japan, but it does have English. There are 2 wizardry games on the Switch, one that has a physical release and the other that will in the future. Now I know, these are not actually JRPGs, this is a Western franchise, but the odd thing about this series is that, despite that, is actually way more popular in Japan, and there are almost more Japanese spin-off games than actually Western mainline ones. They are nuts for it over there, so I am giving it honorary status. In fact, pretty much all of these types of games in this video are probably directly inspired by these games. It's a legendary series. Wizardry Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord is a remake of the first game in the series, has a European retail release, and Limited Run have done it in North America. As for Wizardry The 5 Ordeals, this is releasing physically in Japan early next year, where it will have English. There is no word of a Western physical as of yet, but it can and I think it may happen, but we don't know for sure. Dora, think the thrilling brain adventure of Nobita, is partly a first-person dungeon crawling RPG. And yes, there is a Doraemon dungeon crawling RPG, like, it's unbelievable. But it's mixed in with an educational game, and that is truly fascinating. I haven't played this myself, but I really want to give it a try. The physical release was in Japan and Asia, but it does have English. I just wish it wasn't so expensive so I could buy it. Demon Gaze Extra is another really meaty dungeon crawling RPG. This is formerly a Vita game, but now has bonus features on the Switch. It can be compared to something like Moero Crystal H, but not leaning too heavily on the fan service. There is a few scantily clad ladies here and there, and it commands a price probably for that alone, since the gameplay itself is pretty run-of-the-mill. It's a good and fine time, but maybe doesn't stand out a whole lot. Now, in Europe, that was published physically by Red Art Games, and they've had another RPG. This time an action RPG in El Renteros Wanderings, which I've got to be honest is as questionable as the name itself. I made a video about this game and I was not sold on it. It seemed overly basic and the world seemed incredibly lifeless. Like, I didn't like it at all, to be honest. Goblin Slayer, another adventurer Nightmare Feast, is another Red Art Games release, and this looks to be their best one yet. It is a tactical RPG similar to Final Fantasy Tactics, but using the IP of a light novel. I recently made a video about it and I did enjoy it. Of course it's not as good as Final Fantasy Tactics, but it's got a polar bear priest. How can you go wrong with that? Grandia HD Collection is a fine collection of two classic JRPGs, one of which was on the PlayStation 1, the other on the Dreamcast, and it's a nice essential package. These games have such a good adventurous feeling, reminds me a bit of Skies of Arcadia in that as well. Limited Run did this in North America, but there is also a more readily accessible Asian release that has English, and is one of the most popular imports of all time for good reason. If you are a JRPG fan and you never played these before, do it. I order you to. Eternal Radiance is an action RPG with a strong element of visual novel about it. It's a fun enough game, even if it all comes together a bit too simply. Maybe not enough meat on the bone for most action RPG fans, but if you want something breezy, then it should be a decent one. This released physically only in Southeast Asia, but it does have English. Merchant Forest Milne of the Forest Gift is an absolute fever dream of a game. It's actually kind of like 3 games in one. The first part, not a JRPG, but the second 2 are. And even then, they both kind of play a little bit differently. Same story, but play differently. Are they good? Not really, but they are charming and I did enjoy my time with this game. The physical release for this was only in Japan and some other Asian regions. It's not easy to get a hold of these days, but it does play in English if you want to try and find a copy. Mato Anomalies is a JRPG mixed with a detective visual novel. An interesting mix for sure. There's a side dose of Persona in here in terms of the visual presentation, but don't go fully in expecting that or you will be disappointed. It's often found really cheap these days, so give it a shot if you want something that looks like it's got a little bit of budget behind it, but actually doesn't. Mega Man Battle Network Legacy Collection. Are these RPGs? The internet tells me they are, but I don't know. I've never been a Mega Man fan, so I've never found the need to play these. There's popular spin-off titles, but I've never played them. This collection contains all 10 games in the series, which is crazy to think about. Consider how much value is in this one package, and they're all together on one cartridge, which is fantastic. I've been tempted to get this myself just because of the value and completeness. It's worth noting that this did not get a physical release in Europe, only North America and Asian regions. If you want some proper, no doubt about it JRPGs from Capcom, then look no further than the couple of Monster Hunter Stories games available on the Switch. Monster Hunter Stories 2 Wings of Ruin was the first one on the system, and for all intents and purposes, it gave Pokemon a run for its money when it came to similar kind of gameplay, but with much bigger production value. Very solid title. Years later, we finally got the first game in the series, which was originally a 3DS game, Monster Hunter Stories. It had a very awkward physical release on the Switch. The Western release was bloated and overpriced since it had the first game on the cartridge, but they also decided to bundle it with the second game as a download code. It literally made no sense aside from them being able to jack up the price. However, Japan had the sense, and they released the first game physically as a standalone title, and it only cost $20. So while it's not technically an import exclusive, it's just undeniably a better option. Mistover is a game you can only get physically now since it's been delisted from the eShop and deleted from the internet entirely, so if you want this you can try and find a physical copy, hopefully for less than $100, but not to worry if you can't, because the game isn't that good, it's just rare, and it was an import exclusive, only released in Japan and Asia. Neo Geo Pocket Color Selection Volume 2. Now I know what you're thinking, what does a collection of miniature SNK fighters and card games have to do with a JRPG list? Well, Biomortar Unitron would like to say hello. It's not a great JRPG, even for the portable system, but it's a JRPG nonetheless. So if you are a true JRPG Switch completionist, do not miss Neo Geo Pocket Color Selection Volume 2. Limited Run did this in North America, but it got a retail release in Europe and Asia and Japan. Ninja Jajamaru Legendary Ninja Collection might be a bit of a similar situation. This is the version that released exclusively to strictly limited games, not the retail release, okay? Not the retail release. Because strictly limited version had 2 extra games, both of which are rudimentary RPGs translated into English for the first time. These are called Ninja Jajamaru, the Ninja Skill Book, and Ninja Jajamaru, the Legend of the Golden Castle, and both were only on the Famicom. Not worth rushing out for to track down a copy, but I appreciate the effort to translate these to English for the first time. I just wish they were also on the retail release, not limited to strictly limited games. Omega Labyrinth Life is a bit like a mystery dungeon game. I know some people don't count them as a JRPG, but I think they are adjacent enough, plus it has big boobs in it, okay? And you get to do some things with the girls that you probably shouldn't do with girls. It's an import exclusive, and if you want English, you'll have to purchase the Asian version. Do not get the Japanese one. This is one of the most highly cultured, shall we say, physical releases on the Switch, okay? Before you buy it, make sure you do some research first, okay? And then delete your browser history. The Shiren the Wanderer series is a proper mystery dungeon game, and there are 2 on the Switch. There was a port of the 4th main game, Shiren the Wanderer Dice of Fate, and a recent brand new entry in Serpent Coil Island. Both great games if you're into the subgenre. I enjoy them, but it just makes me wish for a port of Azure Dreams. Come on Konami, you can do it. Katana Kami is a similar kind of game, but this time action-based rather than turn-based. It's also a bit like Moonlighter, where you have 2 gameplay parts. One is the dungeon crawling and looting, but then you have to manage a blacksmith later on. The physical release for this was only in Japan, but it does have English, and these days it's often found quite cheap too. Yuden Chronicle 100 Heroes was supposed to be the successor to Konami's Suikoden series, in fact developed by the dude who created the Suikoden series. It was kickstarted to massive success, and although it had a good few hurdles along the way, such as a poor translation to English, performance issues on the Switch, and the passing of Yoshitaka Murayama himself, it's done a good job of bringing the style of JRPG we loved about Suikoden back to the table. Although I do advise playing it on a console other than the Switch. Gensei Suikoden Plus sadly doesn't have anything to do with Konami's JRPG franchise, but it's kind of clever marketing because it certainly made me pay attention to it. In fact, it's a harmless, decent time that reminds me of a Kemco RPG, just a slight step up, and it's full of humor. I kind of liked it. The physical was only in Japan, but it does have English. Alright, let's stop beating around the bush and end with the biggest and most exciting JRPG heading our way next year. Suikoden 1 and 2 HD Remaster is something I've been asking almost decades for. It's a HD remake of the first 2 games in one of the most underappreciated JRPG series. 2 PS1 classics that deserve another chance in the spotlight. They are a perfect duology. 2 great connected stories, hundreds of recruitable characters between the 2, and I get nostalgic, almost tearing up thinking about, playing these as a kid, especially the first one. Either way, masterpieces that should be played. When this arrives in March next year, you guys, you better buy it, okay? Whew, are you still here? That was a big old list. I think it was twice as long as last year's. I don't know how, but I just almost wrote 20,000 words about JRPGs on the Switch. If you like that and you want to support me, I have Patreon links in the description. You can also purchase video games via the links in the description as well, and that massively helps me out. And also, subscribe. This channel has so much going on if you enjoy physical media, and I hope you all have a fantastic day. Take care.